January 12, 1943. The Eastern Front was a blinding white canvas of suffering stretching endlessly across the frozen Russian steppe. The temperature had plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius for the 5th consecutive night, and the men of the 376th Infantry Regiment had long since abandoned any hope that this frozen hell might soon release them from its grip. 3 days earlier, they had received orders to establish a defensive position 15 kilometers southwest of Volchansk, a seemingly insignificant point on the map between Kharkov and Stalingrad, where the fate of the entire eastern campaign hung in the balance. As the pale winter sun struggled to penetrate the thick cloud cover, Oberleutnant Werner Holzinger lowered his field glasses and exhaled slowly, his breath crystallizing instantly in the frigid air. The past month had transformed this once ambitious officer into a hollow-eyed survivor, haunted by the knowledge that the Russian winter was proving more lethal than any enemy bullet. The Soviet counteroffensive following the disaster at Stalingrad was gaining momentum with each passing day, and intelligence reports warned of massive Red Army troop movements throughout the sector. Holzinger's company was tasked with monitoring a narrow valley that cut through the rolling terrain like a frozen scar. From his vantage point on the ridge, he could see the entire length of the ice-covered valley below, where 3 days earlier, a heavy snowfall had blanketed everything in pristine white. Nothing moved across this desolate landscape, except for the occasional raven, black against the snow, searching for the dead. Beside him, Feldwebel Kurt Neumann stamped his feet against the cold, the leather of his boots cracking audibly in the stillness. "Sir, the men are reporting something strange in the valley. Broder swears he saw steam rising from the snow near the eastern end, close to that cluster of dead trees." Holzinger raised his field glasses again, scanning the area Neumann had indicated. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just endless white, punctuated by the skeletal silhouettes of leafless trees. Then, almost imperceptibly, he noticed it, faint vapor rising from the snow, dissipating quickly in the frigid air. Yet Brandt and his reconnaissance squad tell them to approach with extreme caution. No unnecessary risks. We observe first. Neumann nodded and moved away, his form hunched against the bitter cold. Within 20 minutes, Holzinger watched through his binoculars as 6 men in white camouflage capes made their way cautiously down the slope toward the mysterious anomaly. The squad moved with the practiced precision of veterans, spreading out to minimize risk as they approached the area where the vapor had been spotted. Through his field glasses, Holzinger saw the point man, Gefreiter Brandt, suddenly halt and signal to the others. The squad converged slowly, and even from this distance Holzinger could sense their confusion. Brandt knelt in the snow, brushing at something with his gloved hand. Then, inexplicably, he turned and waved urgently back toward Holzinger's position. 30 minutes later, Brandt stood before Holzinger in the cramped command dugout, snow still clinging to his uniform. "Sir, you're not going to believe this. There are tanks buried in the ice down there, Soviet T-34s, at least 3 that we could identify." Holzinger stared at the young soldier, certain he had misunderstood. "Tanks? Are you saying the Soviets deliberately sank tanks in the valley?" Brandt shook his head. "No, sir. It appears they were crossing the frozen river last month when the ice gave way. The river must have frozen solid again around them. The strange thing is, sir, we can hear engines. At least one of them is still running. That's what's causing the steam. Exhaust venting through a small gap in the ice." The implications struck Holzinger immediately. During the chaotic Soviet retreat months earlier, these tanks had attempted to cross the frozen river, but had broken through the ice. Instead of abandoning their vehicles, at least some of the Soviet crews had remained inside, keeping their engines running to stay alive in the sub-zero temperatures. The ice had refrozen around them, creating a bizarre tomb of steel and ice, with living men still trapped inside. "How thick is the ice covering them?" Holzinger asked. "Variable, sir. In some places nearly a meter, in others only 15 or 20 centimeters. We could see the outline of a turret in one spot where the snow had blown clear." Holzinger considered the situation carefully. If operational Soviet tanks with combat-ready crews were about to emerge from the ice, his company of exhausted infantrymen would be dangerously exposed in their current positions. Dawn broke the next morning with a clarity that transformed the landscape into a realm of harsh beauty. The temperature had risen slightly, enough to make the ice groan and shift across the valley floor. Holzinger had spent the night repositioning his men and their few precious anti-tank weapons to cover the area where the submerged tanks had been discovered. He had also sent runners to battalion headquarters, requesting urgent anti-tank support, though he held little hope that overstretched resources would materialize in time. As the pale sunlight strengthened, the steam venting from beneath the ice became more visible, an ethereal column rising into the still air. Through his binoculars, Holzinger could now clearly discern the dark shapes beneath the translucent surface. The unmistakable silhouette of a T-34's sloped armor, its long gun barrel extended like an accusing finger, pointed toward the German lines. Feldwebel Neumann approached, his face grave. "Sir, the ice is thinning. Our engineer says the exhaust heat has been melting it from below. It won't hold much longer." Holzinger nodded. "Have the men hold their positions. No one fires until I give the order." The waiting was excruciating. For 3 hours nothing changed except the gradually thinning ice and the increasing visibility of the entombed steel beasts below. Then, shortly before midday, a groaning crack echoed across the valley, followed by the sound of breaking ice. Holzinger watched, transfixed, as a jagged fissure spread across the frozen surface. Water welled up, dark against the white, and then, with a surge of power that sent ice fragments exploding outward, the first T-34 broke through the surface. The sight was otherworldly. The tank rose like a prehistoric monster emerging from primordial depths, sheets of ice sliding from its sloped armor, its engine roaring defiance. Steam billowed around it, creating an obscuring cloud that lent the scene an almost supernatural quality. Before Holzinger could give the order to fire, the tank's turret swiveled, its 76mm gun seeking targets. A second crack resonated through the valley as another patch of ice gave way. A second T-34 began to emerge, and then a third, each breaking free from their icy prison with a violence that sent tremors through the ground. "Open fire!" Holzinger shouted, and immediately the sharp crack of the company's two 75mm anti-tank guns shattered the frozen air. The first shell struck the lead T-34 squarely on its frontal armor, but to Holzinger's dismay, the round deflected harmlessly, skipping skyward like a stone across water. The tank continued its inexorable advance up the sloping bank, its tracks churning through snow and mud, while its gun returned fire with devastating effect. The first shell obliterated one of the German anti-tank positions, sending men and equipment cartwheeling through the air in a spray of crimson against the white backdrop. The second T-34 had now fully emerged and was angling toward the German right flank, while the third maneuvered to the left, attempting to encircle Holzinger's position. Despite the months of ice entombment, the Soviet tank crews operated with a coordination that spoke of extensive experience and iron discipline. Their engines, remarkably preserved in the constant sub-zero temperatures, functioned with deadly efficiency, sending the 30-ton machines surging through the snow with frightening mobility. Holzinger's men fought with the desperate courage of those who have no retreat. The Panzerfaust teams waited until the tanks had approached to within 30 meters before launching their shaped charges, aiming for the more vulnerable rear and side armor. One T-34 erupted in flames when a lucky shot penetrated its engine compartment, a fire so intense that it melted the surrounding snow into a widening black pool. The crew attempted to escape, emerging from the hatches like wraiths through the smoke, only to be cut down by German machine gun fire. But the other two tanks pressed relentlessly forward, their machine guns scything through the German positions, their main guns demolishing one strongpoint after another. The battle reached its climax when the lead T-34, now only 20 meters from Holzinger's command position, suddenly ground to a halt, a plume of black smoke erupting from its engine compartment. For a moment, an eerie silence descended, broken only by the groaning of metal cooling in the frigid air. Then, with a metallic shriek, the tank's turret hatch flew open and a figure emerged. A Soviet officer, his face blackened with soot, his uniform crusted with ice. He stood upright in the hatch, seemingly oblivious to the German guns trained on him, and surveyed the carnage with an expression of grim satisfaction. Then, with deliberate slowness, he drew his sidearm and fired a single shot into the air. It was a signal. From the tree line at the far end of the valley, a new sound arose, the unmistakable rumble of approaching armor, dozens of engines merging into a thunderous avalanche of steel. The ice-entombed tanks had been merely the vanguard, sent ahead to probe the German defenses. Now the main force of the Soviet 5th Tank Army was arriving, their T-34s adorned with fresh winter camouflage, their red stars stark against the white paint. Holzinger knew in that moment that his company was doomed. They might account for a few more Soviet tanks, extract a price in blood for this frozen patch of Russian earth, but the outcome was inevitable. He thought briefly of the letters in his breast pocket, the ones he had written to his wife and children, letters filled with reassurances he no longer believed himself. He thought of home, of Bavaria in springtime, of cherry blossoms and warm beer and laughter, things that seemed to belong to another lifetime, another world far removed from this white hell of ice and steel and death. As the Soviet tanks advanced in a widening wedge formation, Feldwebel Neumann appeared at Holzinger's side, his face a mask of stoic resignation. "Orders, sir." Holzinger stared for a moment at the approaching armored wave, then turned to his loyal sergeant. "Send runners to the platoons, fall back to the secondary positions at Hill 247. We'll make another stand there." Neumann hesitated. "There's no stopping them, sir." "Not with what we have left." Holzinger nodded. "I know, but we can slow them down. Give the rest of the regiment time to prepare. That's all we can do now." As his men began their fighting withdrawal, Holzinger took one last look at the valley below, where the first T-34 still burned fiercely, a black scar on the white landscape. He thought about the men who had survived for weeks inside their frozen steel coffin, keeping their engines running, waiting with inhuman patience for the moment to strike. Such determination was terrifying to contemplate. The retreat from Volchansk became a desperate race against time and the elements. The temperature dropped precipitously as night fell, and the wind whipped across the steppe with renewed fury, driving needle-sharp ice crystals into exposed skin. Holzinger's dwindling company moved in small groups, taking advantage of whatever cover the terrain provided, always conscious of the Soviet armor that pursued them relentlessly across the frozen landscape. By midnight, they had reached Hill 247, a low, rounded eminence that offered minimal protection, but at least provided clear lines of fire in all directions. Here, they would make their stand, buying time for the main German forces to organize a more substantial defensive line further west. The night passed in a haze of exhaustion and bone-deep cold. Men dozed standing up, afraid to lie down lest they never rise again. The few remaining medical supplies were distributed to the wounded, who could still fight. The others had been left behind with a single medic in an abandoned farmhouse, their fate now in the hands of the advancing Soviets. Holzinger moved among his men, sharing cigarettes, offering what encouragement he could, though his words sounded hollow even to his own ears. The truth was etched in every face. They were trapped between an implacable enemy and the killing winter, with little hope of salvation from either. Dawn revealed the full extent of their predicament. The Soviet tanks had deployed in a wide semicircle around the base of Hill 247, their crews clearly visible as they conducted maintenance and prepared for the final assault. Holzinger counted at least 15 T-34s, plus several lighter tanks, and what appeared to be a full battalion of infantry moving up in support. Against this force, he had 47 men, one functioning anti-tank gun with 11 rounds of ammunition, and a handful of Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. The outcome was a foregone conclusion. At 0730 hours, the Soviet attack began with a rolling artillery barrage that churned the frozen earth of Hill 247 into a chaos of ice, mud, and shattered rock. The German defenders huddled in their shallow foxholes, each man alone with his fear as the world exploded around them. When the barrage lifted, the Soviet tanks advanced in a coordinated rush, their engines roaring as they climbed the gentle slope, their guns firing with methodical precision. The German anti-tank gun claimed 2 victims before a direct hit silenced it forever. The Panzerfaust teams accounted for 3 more, but it was like trying to stop a flood with a handful of pebbles. The Soviet armor rolled inexorably forward, crushing machine gun nests, obliterating mortar positions, reducing Holzinger's company to scattered pockets of increasingly desperate resistance. By mid-morning, Holzinger found himself with only 7 men in a small depression near the crest of the hill, their ammunition nearly exhausted, their bodies numb with cold and fatigue. 100 meters away, a T-34 ground to a halt, its turret traversing slowly toward their position. Holzinger recognized it immediately as one of the tanks that had emerged from the ice the previous day. Its hull still bore the streaks of frozen river water, now transformed into grotesque ice sculptures by the extreme cold. As the tank's main gun aligned with their position, Holzinger closed his eyes, his thoughts turning once more to home, to the life he had lived before this war had consumed everything. The expected shell never came. Instead, a different sound intruded on his consciousness, the distinctive engine note of a German Panzer Y4, followed by the sharp crack of its 75mm gun. Holzinger's eyes snapped open to see the Soviet T-34 engulfed in flames, its turret blown completely off, its crew scrambling desperately to escape the inferno. Beyond it, advancing down the reverse slope of Hill 247, came a dozen Panzer armies, their white camouflage making them almost invisible against the snow-covered landscape. Supporting them were 2 companies of panzer grenadiers in half-tracks, their weapons already engaging the surprised Soviet infantry. The German counterattack had materialized from nowhere, catching the Soviet forces in a vulnerable position as they concentrated on eliminating Holzinger's company. Within minutes, the battlefield was transformed. The hunters became the hunted, the encirclers became the encircled. The Soviet tanks attempted to regroup, but the German Panthers pressed their advantage relentlessly, their superior gunnery picking off the T-34s one by one from beyond the effective range of the Soviet 76mm guns. By noon, the surviving Soviet forces were in full retreat, abandoning their wounded and much of their equipment as they fled back toward the frozen valley from which their attack had originated. Holzinger watched in stunned disbelief as a half-track pulled up beside his position, and a Hauptmann in the immaculate uniform of the Großdeutschland division jumped down, striding toward him with the confidence of one to whom defeat is an alien concept. Oberleutnant Holzinger, I am Hauptmann Steiner, Panzer Regiment Großdeutschland. We received your runner yesterday. Remarkable that the man made it through the Soviet lines. You and your men have done an extraordinary job holding this position. We would not have been able to spring our trap without your sacrifice. Sacrifice. The word echoed in Holzinger's mind as he surveyed the shattered remains of his company. Of the 160 men who had deployed to Volchansk a week earlier, fewer than 30 still lived, and many of those were wounded. They had paid a terrible price to buy time for this counterattack, price measured in young lives and broken bodies. Yet as he watched the German armor pursue the retreating Soviets across the steppe, Holzinger could not escape the feeling that this was merely a temporary reprieve, a minor eddy in the inexorable current that was now flowing westward, back toward Germany. The Soviets would return, with more men, more tanks, more of the implacable determination that had allowed their crews to survive for weeks entombed in ice, waiting for their moment to strike. 3 days later, the remnants of Holzinger's company were withdrawn to a field hospital 20 kilometers behind the front line. Counterattack had succeeded in temporarily stabilizing the sector, pushing the Soviets back across the frozen river and establishing a new defensive perimeter that incorporated the natural barrier. But reports from other sectors were grim. Soviet advance continued unabated along a broad front, with German forces falling back in good order where possible, in chaotic rout where necessary. The strategic initiative had passed irrevocably to the Red Army, and no amount of tactical brilliance or local counterattacks could alter that fundamental reality. As Holzinger sat in the crowded officers' ward, a bandage covering the shrapnel wounds on his left arm, he found his thoughts returning repeatedly to the image of those tanks emerging from the ice, the impossible survival, the inhuman patience, the implacable advance of machines that should, by any rational calculation, have been dead and frozen, along with their crews. It seemed to him a perfect metaphor for the Russian war machine itself, battered but unbroken, submerged but not destroyed, waiting with infinite patience for the moment to re-emerge and exact its terrible revenge. The story of the ice-entombed tanks entered the folklore of the Eastern Front, repeated in hushed tones in field hospitals and reinforcement depots, embellished with each retelling until the tanks became an entire armored division, the ice a frozen lake, the emergence a supernatural resurrection. Few believed the literal truth that Soviet tank crews had survived for weeks inside their vehicles, trapped in the ice, keeping their engines running, waiting with cold-blooded patience for the moment to strike. But for those who had been there, who had witnessed the steel beasts rising from their white tomb, no embellishment was necessary. The reality had been terrifying enough. The war on the Eastern Front was a conflict unlike any other in human history, a struggle not merely between armies, but between fundamentally different conceptions of human endurance and sacrifice. In that frozen valley near Volchansk, the limits of both had been tested and transcended in ways that would haunt the survivors for the remainder of their lives. As the tide of war turned inexorably against the Third Reich, as the Red Army continued its westward advance through 1943 and into 1944, many German soldiers who had served on the Eastern Front would remember that winter morning when Soviet tanks rose from the ice, an omen of the fate that awaited their own ambitions in the frozen wasteland of Russia. For you who have followed this journey into the frozen heart of the most terrible conflict in human history, consider what remains when all the strategic calculations and ideological justifications have crumbled to dust: the human capacity for endurance, the will to survive against all odds, the determination to emerge from even the most impossible entombment. The tanks of Volchansk, buried in ice yet still operational, serve as both historical curiosity and potent metaphor. A reminder that what appears defeated may simply be waiting, engines running, for the moment when the ice begins to crack. In your own darkest hours, remember this truth and keep your own engines running. Thaw will come, the ice will break, and you too will rise again.